Hi everyone, we're just giving it 1 or 2 more minutes to let everyone join in who's registered, and then we'll begin this presentation. Yes, I'm just giving, so I had a question here whether someone was connected. I'm just giving this a few more seconds and then I'll get started to give everyone a chance to join before I start presenting. If you have any problems hearing me right now, pop a message in the chat and we'll try and solve that for you. Okay, it's 2 minutes past, so I think I'm going to get started. So hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for what I think is going to be a really exciting webinar on Digitising Canada, highlights of online primary sources for teaching and learning. My name is Laura Blumval and I'm a product specialist at Adam Matthew, a digital primary source publisher based in the UK. Bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue à ce séminaire en ligne intitulé Numériser le Canada. Aujourd'hui, je vais présenter avec mes collègues un bref aperçu des sources primaires en ligne pour l'enseignement et l'apprentissage. Je m'appelle Laura Blumval et je suis une spécialiste de produits en Adam Matthew Digital, un éditeur des sources primaires en ligne basé en Angleterre. La plus grande partie de ce séminaire sera en anglais, mais je vais également vous présenter un bref aperçu des sources primaires francophones pour celles et ceux d'entre vous intéressés par les sources bilingues publiées dans nos collections. Can I have the next slide, please, Alex? So I wanted to start this session with a number. The number is 71, and I wonder if you know what that might stand for. If you have any guesses, there's a chat function on this webinar. If you press the little orange arrow on your screen, you should be able to expand the control panel and you can send us your guesses. Great. I'm seeing a few things come in, and please feel free to use this chat function throughout the webinar to submit any questions at any point, and we will use your questions to shape our conversation during the Q&A at the end. Can I have the next slide, please, Alex? So in fact, earlier today, I ran a search for the word Canada and I used a wildcard asterisk at the end to allow variants like Canada's, Canadian, Canadien, or Canadienne on our AM Explorer platform, which gives you a single point of access with built-in federated search functionality across our collections. And this search returned results from 71 different Adam Matthew databases in total, representing 20 years of publishing by Adam Matthew. And this number would be even bigger if you included our microfilm publications from the 1990s, much of which has now been digitized in our research source product portfolio. Next slide. So before, the main way researchers would access the information they needed would be to secure a research grant and physically to travel to that archive. And what Adam Matthew databases aim to do is to open up that same opportunity to a university's entire research community. Slide. And as some of you may know, over the years, we have partnered with many Canadian archives, libraries, and museums to digitize their content and to make their brilliant archives available to students and researchers at universities around the world. And you can see the list of Canadian institutions we have partnered with in the past in our digital publications, some of them many times across multiple databases to digitize their amazing materials. And I just wanted to take a second again to turn this webinar over to the audience, and you can submit your answers again by using the chat function of the webinar. So can I have the next slide, please? So my question to you is, do you have a favorite special collection that you would love to see digitized by us and made available to students? And I just want you to take a moment to think about this. It could be maybe a museum or an oral history collection in Canada, or maybe it's a special collection somewhere else in the world, but it's really rich on a theme in Canadian culture or history. And maybe it would make your life easier not to always have to apply for a research grant in order for you or your PhD students to visit that collection in person. Great, I'm seeing some responses coming in. Oh, great. Someone mentioned the Angeli Dennis collection at UBC. We've got someone mentioning Hudson Bay Company archives. Oh, this is really interesting. Thank you, everyone. And you might want a little bit more time to think about this, which is not a problem at all. So if a special collection comes to your mind that you would really like to see digitized, please pop it into the chat. We would still really love to hear from you and what you would like to see digitized in the future. Can I have the next slide again? So without further ado, today we're really excited to be taking you on a little tour of our favourite primary sources on Canadian history and culture from Adam Matthews' collections. I'll be talking to you later about our collection Medical Services and Warfare and about the French primary sources in colonial America. My colleague Lindsay Gulliver, who is a senior editor at Adam Matthew, will also tell a little bit about the way our editorial team approached Indigenous language content in our collection of First Nation newspapers. But first, I will hand over to my colleague Hans Anders. Hans is an academic outreach and development manager at Adam Matthew, and he'll be showing you some highlights from Migration to New Wales and from World's Fairs. Over to you, Hans.
Thanks very much, Laura. If we could go to the next slide. I'll start us off by talking about our collection Migration to New Worlds, which is an example of a multi-archive project where we work together with 26 libraries from across the world. And the collection tells the story of immigration from Europe and Asia to North America, as well as Australasia, covering a time period from 1800 to 1980. And the collection is broken down into two modules in a chronological way. So you have the first module on the century of immigration and the second module on the modern era. And there are three Canadian archives that contributed to this resource: the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Halifax, the Glenville Museum in Calgary, and Libraries and Archives Canada in Ottawa. And broadly, as the title already gives it away, what this resource does, it tells the story of the push and pull factors for migration during the century of migration, the journey to these places, and then it also explores what happens afterwards. And it does that through a variety of different document types, such as correspondence, government records, photographs, and ephemera. And I think it's really important to highlight that with all of our collections, we try to bring in different perspectives. So you have the official records, but then you also have the more personal story of what is happening. And these records and these documents are broken down into a number of different thematic areas that you can also you can search the collections and explore the collection via these thematic areas. And I thought I would just highlight a few that are especially relevant for Canada. So for example, you have motives for migration, such as employment opportunities in Canada. We have a thematic area on ships and shipping lines, for example, the White Star Line with the Titanic, the Cunard Line that operated between Liverpool and Halifax. You have material on the journey conditions, for example, personal diaries and the logbooks of ship doctors. You have material on arrivals, meaning the ports of entry and early experiences, and for Canada, that would be in particular Halifax and Quebec. You have material on thematic area on displaced persons and refugees. So for example, Jewish refugees that are coming to Canada from World War II Europe. And then another important part in particular related to Canada would be permanent settlement and successive generations. So we have a nice selection of homesteading papers from the prairies. And I thought it would be a nice way to explore the collection and to really show you the wealth of the documents is to pick one particular immigrant experience and to explore that through some of the different documents that are in the collection to really show you how you can jump around and put together a narrative very much like a student might do in a class. Can we have the next slide, Alex? So the example that I picked to start us off is an oral history interview with a refugee, my namesake Hans Skutajan, who in this oral history interview recounts arriving from Czechoslovakia via Great Britain in 1339. So he arrived in Halifax after his family escaped Austria after the German invasion of the Sudetenland, and he boarded a Cunard liner sailed from Liverpool to Halifax. And if you just read through that little excerpt from the oral history interview, he mentions a few things. So he mentioned the ship that he boarded, the Samaria, and he also then talks about settling in or being settled in northern Saskatchewan. And so if you use that as a starting point, for example, you're interested in the Samaria, if you go to the next slide, we actually do have a picture and several pictures of the Samaria, and that's what it would have looked like around the time of when Hans made that trip to Halifax. And if we go to the next slide, that's an example of a leaflet for prospective immigrants from the Glenbow Museum, which I think is visually quite stunning. And if you open that up, Alex, I hope you can see that, but basically this is the first page, and I found it quite striking. The first paragraph talks about how Canada is the land of new opportunities, just as the Western states opened up new opportunities half a century ago. So Canada opens up new opportunities today. New opportunities and new land, rich, fertile, productive land, always go together. Canada offers both. So they managed to use the word opportunity 4 times in across two sentences, which I think is quite remarkable. And yeah, so this would be the kind of leaflet that Hans probably would have seen when he and his family were about to emigrate to Canada. And then he, as he told us in the oral history interview, he settled in Saskatchewan. If we go to the next slide, we actually have quite a few photographs, and this is a homesteading farm in Regina in Saskatchewan. So this could very well be the type of house that Hans then settled in. If we go to the next slide, moving beyond Hans's story, one thing that really stands out across all of our collections is the contextual framework, and so we include a lot of interactive features and tools that create jumping off points for the user, for students, if they want to find an entryway or entry point into the collection. And we've done this for Gros Isle, which is the entry point for migrants coming to Quebec, very much like Ellis Island in the US. And this station was active from 1832 to 1937. And what we've done in this interactive feature is we've provided a narrative of the history of Gros Isle and the significance it has in Canadian history, as over 4.1 million people passed through flew there from 1832 to 1937. And it also served as a quarantine station for migrants who were arrived in Canada sick, and that was of particular importance also during the flu pandemic. And I think that's something of 1918, and that's something that Laura is going to touch on later. So that's just a little snapshot of migration to new worlds. But let's move on to another collection called World's Fairs, which looks at the history of World's Fairs literally since they began in 1851 all the way to 2015, and has material on every World's Fair during that time period. And it's another example of a multi-archive collection where we work together with 14 different archives. Expo 67 in Montreal, this is the picture you can see here, is a huge part of the collection because it was a very significant World's Fair during the 20th century. As we get into the time where World's Fairs as an event are winding down, so it's often been described as the final truly global World's Fair of the 20th century. And with regard to Canada, there's also material on the much lesser known Expo 86 in Vancouver, which actually happened to be the very last World's Fair that was held in North America. And in terms of Canadian archives that contributed to World's Fairs, there's Libraries and Archives Canada. It's the only Canadian archive, but then there's also significant Canada-related material from the UK National Archives. And then we also were able to include a private collection from California State University, Fresno, of a private collector who from early in the 20th century visited every World's Fair, and then also brought back a lot of material from Montreal and Vancouver that has been included. And just to take a quick look at the Expo 67 in Montreal that took place from April to October in 1967. If we go to the next slide, Alex, there were over 54 million visitors, and it's often described as one of the most significant events in Canada's history at the time, also in terms of opening up the country on a global scale. And the fair was all about a futuristic and utopian vision for humanity under the theme "Man and His World." And I picked this poster, that encourages you to bring your camera to the fair, because one of the document types that of which there's the most in the collection are actually photographs. So the collection really enables you to visit the site through those photographs, and it's almost as if you're there, because there's so many different perspectives and angles on what's happening. If you go to the next slide, Alex, that includes this nice snapshot of Queen Elizabeth II as she visits the exhibition. And this ties in nicely. If we go to the next slide, we talked earlier about the interactive features that we've included, and what we've actually done with World's Fairs is we put together an interactive site map that is based on the plans for the fair, and used, again, just like with the photographs, you can literally walk around the fairgrounds, and if you click on the numbers here, you can see what used to be in a particular place. And even if you go to Montreal today, to Quebec today, and visit these sites, you can actually retrace some of the history of the fair as it lives on in the architecture of Montreal. And as a little gem, I thought I'd share a poster. This is the final image. This is called Spirit Lodge. It's quite interesting. This was a presentation at the General Motors Pavilion, and this is a whole of vision technology presentation, which was quite cutting edge at the time, that allows the onstage actor in this presentation to appear to control smoke and vapor around him or her, and to cause the vapors to condense and form images that seem to interact with him and to respond to the actor. So this is the same type of technology, or similar technology, that we see today in holograms when famous people are being brought back to life. And this was included as a nod to Canada's first people, so it had kind of a spiritual theme and was a huge success. And I did a bit of research around this, so there's certainly that first people's angle, but it was also there are a lot of internet sleuths who are interested in World's Fairs who revisit these events, and apparently the Spirit Lodge presentation was seen as a lot of people have interpreted as an example of how General Motors wanted to promote the freedom of travel. So since this is from the Expo 86, you could see this in the context of the Cold War, and maybe it's a slightly subversive message towards the Soviet Union, who was also an exhibitor at the fair in Vancouver. And I think that's a nice example of the type of questions the documents in the collection can encourage. But with that First Nations, First Peoples angle, I thought that would be a nice way to turn things over to my colleague Lindsay, who's going to talk about a collection closely related to First Peoples.
Thank you very much, Hans. Hello everyone, my name is Lindsay. I'm an editor at Adam Matthew, and I was a member of the team who worked on this collection of historic newspapers produced by US and Canadian First Peoples. Could I have the next slide, please, Alex? Thank you. Primarily sourced from the Sequoia National Research Center in Arkansas, with additional materials supplemented from the Newberry Library in Chicago, this exceptional collection includes over 9,000 newspapers and periodicals published by Indigenous communities across the US and Canada between 1828 and 2016. Examples of titles published by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and missionary groups have also been included. So often, the histories of Indigenous peoples have been written by outsiders, but the truly unique thing about this resource is that it allows students and researchers to delve into a collection of primary sources which show how current events were reported by and for Indigenous communities. It was very important to us that this collection was shaped by the communities who produced these newspapers, and the resource was only made possible with the permission of and in close collaboration with the publishers and tribal councils. These newspapers track the emergence of Indigenous journalism in the 1820s through to the proliferation of the press during the occupation of Wounded Knee, right up to the modern day, and include commentary on topics such as public health, language revitalization, activism, environmentalism, education, and community news. Can I have the next slide, please? So amongst the 45 titles represented in this collection, we've included several produced by First Nations, including newspapers from Ontario, Newfoundland, and British Columbia. In particular, I'd like to quickly draw your attention to The Indian, which you'll see on this slide. Appearing in 1885, this was the first newspaper to be published by an Indigenous Canadian and was circulated across Ontario's Indian reserves. Primarily, this was an educational publication, which was intended to inform the First Nations people about Canadian legislation which directly impacted them. For example, in this first issue, there were many notes on the Indian Franchise Act. Could I have the next slide, please? Rather than applying metadata manually to these newspapers, the decision was made early on in the production process to apply MET's Alto technology to all English language newspapers to ensure maximum discoverability. In addition to searching and highlighting hits in the text, this technology allows the user to return results relating to single articles as well as full issues, and highlights those search terms and specific articles on the digitized image, as you can see here. In this example, I performed a search for First Nations, which returns 1,163 different article results, and clicking into just one of those will bring up the specific article in question. However, while this approach was well suited to English language materials, several titles within the collection were written in Indigenous languages, including Navajo, Hawaiian, and Sioux dialects. Could I have the next slide, please? So today, I'd like to show you an example of the newspaper Kamloops Wawa. This is a missionary title, and it was founded in 1891 and published by a French-born Catholic priest with the help of several local women on the Kamloops Indian Reserve. So as you can quite clearly see, this wasn't written in English or French, but in Chinook Wawa, a trading language which is sometimes also known as Chinook jargon. When it came to discoverability in our site, we knew we couldn't apply technical solutions that would allow full text searching of these non-Roman characters. We couldn't manually apply metadata in-house either, but wanted to ensure that these rare issues would still be equally as discoverable and presented in a way that could accurately reflect their valuable content. So we decided to find and commission a Chinook Wawa speaker to index over 150 issues of this newspaper. Now, while it has been estimated that there were around 100,000 speakers in the mid-19th century, today there are believed to be roughly 640 speakers of Chinook Wawa. Quite pleasingly, actually, it was through another newspaper, a contemporary local newspaper, that we were able to stumble across a professor who was discussing her efforts teaching the language at a local community college. We reached out to her and she was able to put us in contact with a network of linguists and student speakers. We prepared a matrix for the chosen contributor to fill out, recording title, date, issue details, as well as fields for description and keywords, which could ensure that these issues would be searched and filtered in a similar way to the English language content. Reading through the results, we found some details that one probably might expect to find in a Catholic missionary newspaper. So Bible stories, the publication of a new Chinook language Bible, psalms and prayers. However, there were also plenty of quite unexpected details recorded. For example, there were responses to people's objections about the variant of shorthand that was being used. There were also comments on disease and temperance. Even astronomy lessons crept in. There's some local colour that shines through as well. In one article, there's news of a priest visiting the town of Bonaparte and he falls from a wild horse and breaks his shoulder, which seems like quite unpriestly behaviour. There's also a prideful dismissal of, quote, the arrogant people who make fun of this newspaper. While it's seemingly innocuous, it was a real pleasure to see details like this drawn out, details about Indigenous language use and everyday life on a 19th century reserve that may otherwise have been completely lost to history. Thank you. I'll just pass back to you, Laura, now.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was fantastic. So I'll now talk to you a little bit about our collection, medical services and warfare. So this database covers major conflicts of the 19th and 20th centuries, from the beginning of the Crimean War to the health and social reforms that followed World War II. And it gathers material from multiple institutions to build a picture of the experience and development of medical practice as influenced by war. And we've also included material on medicine during peacetime, notably through documents relating to the influenza epidemic of 1918, the discovery of penicillin in 1928, and post-war rehabilitation. And it's actually one of my personal favorite collections, just because it facilitates so much exciting research taking place in the field of medical humanities right now. And it really captures the kinds of archives and themes that speak equally to STEM topics like medicine, technology, and psychology, as well as topics in arts and humanities like literature and history. So this collection can be used by students enrolled in a number of different schools and disciplines, and they can do really excitingly different types of research activities using these materials depending on what their specialism is. Next slide, please. And we've actually digitized in this database papers from the Canadian Department of Health and the Canadian Department of National Health and Welfare, held in the Library and Archives Canada. What some of you familiar with their collections will know as the class mark RG29. And these papers are really fascinating in covering the influenza epidemic of 1918 and subsequent outbreaks, covering topics from the cleaning and quarantine of freight ships to government correspondence on how to tackle the crisis. So if I search for the word pandemic in the database and then filter the results only to include material from Library and Archives Canada, I find this document on the right-hand side containing various correspondence from doctors and staff of Canada's government health departments reflecting on experience of the 1918 epidemic and the development of the vaccination and its availability in the 1940s. So that image you see there is a memorandum from the Canadian government on the prevention of influenza. It talks about the lessons learned from the 1918 outbreak, and it goes into a lot of detail on how to accurately count mortality rates from influenza when deaths are sometimes recorded as being caused by a secondary disease that follows influenza, like pneumonia. And interestingly, also talks about the public mood at the time, how the relatively low death rate and the familiarity with the non-pandemic forms of influenza resulted in the disease, quote, breeding contempt in its killing power, end of quote, in the public, and how, quote, the outbreak aroused less anxiety in the public mind than subsequent experience showed to be its due, end of quote. So if you're looking at digitized material from a Canadian library or archive to introduce students to primary source research in an online environment, this might be a really fascinating database to engage students in historical documents because of how topical these documents are today. Can I have the next slide, please? So this database also includes primary source highlights on Canadian war and medical history sourced from other libraries and archives around the world. One of my favorite ones are these letters of a Canadian stretcher bearer on the Western Front, which includes really moving descriptions of dead left unburied in 1918 and more everyday moments like the kicking of gas shells and jealousy over wages. I also really like this magazine article on the right-hand side, which is also from 1918, and it's on Canada's program for rehabilitation of soldiers after the First World War, which would be really fascinating from the point of view of disability studies. And actually, the database is really rich on both visual and textual primary source material, charting the rehabilitation of Canadian soldiers disabled or injured in war. Can I have the next slide again? Thank you. And the final documents that I really love and wanted to point out to you before I move on to our French content in colonial America are these drawings by Florence Nightingale of Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, which we have digitized as part of the Nightingale papers from the British Library. So the design of the Royal Vic was influenced by the ideas of Florence Nightingale, and the separation and isolation of both patients and diseases were thought to discourage the spread of infection. And you can see here her discuss the separation of the site of the infectious hospital and specifying how many beds are allowed on each ward and how the buildings were to be kept really separate from each other, which at the time was a very ambitious and innovative design for a modern hospital. Can I have the next slide, please? Et maintenant, je vais vous donner un bref aperçu des sources primaires françaises dans nos collections. La majorité des collections que nous avons publiées sont en anglais, mais naturellement, les collections avec matériel canadien, français, suisse et belge comprennent du contenu bilingue. Par exemple, les bulletins de l'armée kaki que vous voyez ici publiés en Ottawa pour le directorat des services spéciaux sous la direction du ministère de la Défense nationale pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Nous avons numérisé ces journaux dans notre collection Service Newspapers of World War II. Par ailleurs, vous voyez ici un livre publié à Paris au XVIe siècle intitulé Les singularités de la France antarctique par André TV. Ce livre rassemble des rencontres faites par des marins, des explorateurs et des marchands en Amérique et comprennent entre autres des récits concernant la consommation du tabac au Canada pendant l'époque moderne. Nous avons numérisé ce livre de la New York Public Library dans notre collection Global Commodities. Cette collection documente comment l'histoire du monde a changé après le commerce de 15 marchandises essentielles, par exemple le tabac, l'opium, l'argent, le vin et le bois. Et en effet, nous avons fait des manuels qui détaillent les sources primaires françaises dans 3 de nos collections, à savoir Colonial America, First World War et World Affairs. Et si cela vous intéresse, s'il vous plaît, contactez-nous et nous pouvons vous les envoyer. Can I have the next slide, please? Alors, je voulais également vous donner un bref aperçu de notre collection Colonial America qui couvre l'histoire coloniale de l'Amérique du Nord. Cette collection met à votre disposition l'entièreté de CO5, une série de fichiers qui sont conservés par the National Archives du Royaume-Uni à Londres. Et ces fichiers se composent de la correspondance originale entre le gouvernement britannique et les gouvernements des colonies américaines entre 1606 et 1822. Dans ces collections, l'Amérique était le produit d'une définition britannique des colonies de l'Amérique du Nord et il comprenait des territoires au Canada moderne. Nouveau-Brunswick, Terre-Neuve, Nouvelle-Écosse, Québec et Ontario sont tout fortement présents dans ces fichiers. Next slide, please. And can you press play on the video as well? Alors, cette collection vous permet d'accéder à une archive vaste de 70 000 documents manuscrits et maintenant, vous pouvez les rechercher en utilisant notre technologie pour la reconnaissance du texte manuscrit, en anglais Handwritten Text Recognition Technology, abrévié HTR. HTR est une technologie de recherche révolutionnaire qui utilise des algorithmes complexes et l'intelligence artificielle pour identifier des possibles combinaisons de caractères dans des documents manuscrits. Donc, HTR fonctionne également avec des documents en français. Alors, dans ce petit film, vous voyez comment la technologie a trouvé le mot indien, aussi bien que la phrase indien du Canada, dans un document manuscrit du XVIIe siècle qui parle des Premières Nations et des Iroquois en Amérique du Nord. Et ce document, c'est en réalité une lettre écrite par Richard Coote, le comte de Bellomont, où il décrit des renseignements concernant son plan d'envahir le gouvernement du Canada. Bellomont était un gouverneur colonial basé en New York et dans le nord-est des États-Unis. Cette lettre fait partie de ces difficiles négociations pour empêcher les Iroquois de s'engager dans le pourparlers de paix avec la Nouvelle-France en août 1698. Nous avons numérisé cette lettre dans le premier module de Colonial America ou l'Amérique coloniale qui couvre les thèmes de la première colonisation, l'expansion et les rivalités. Can I have the next slide, please? So, of course, there's been lots that we haven't been able to cover today in our collections since there's so much that we have published over the years. So you can see here, for example, the Canadian rye whiskey adverts from our food and drink in history collection. There's also the Island Men magazine on masculinity, feminism, and male sexuality, published in British Columbia in the 1990s on the left of the hand side of the slide, which you can find in our gender identity and social change collection. And next to that is a photograph from an article by a Canadian war photographer describing the difficulties of capturing the Battle of the Somme in 1916, which we digitized in our First World War collection. Next slide, please. Thanks, Alex. But as a special treat from us to you, we have created this guide to highlights of Canada content from 18 of our collections, which you will receive in the follow-up email to the webinar, along with the recording. And all of the highlights listed on it are hyperlinked back to the Adam Matthew databases, so you can explore these documents and databases for yourself. Next slide, please. And here's a little glimpse of what this tailored guide looks like. And we've looked at 5 collections today. There's 3 more that you can see here, but there's also another 15 collections besides these 3 and the 5 that we've looked at in detail within this guide that we haven't even been able to touch on in the time that we've been talking to you today. So please check your inboxes and make sure you have a look when this is emailed to you. Next slide. So we have about 5 minutes before heading into our Q&A section of the webinar. Please, if you have any questions, you can use the control panel to submit these to us now. But as a last thing before the Q&A, I'm just going to hand over to my lovely colleagues, Alex Burnsides and Jessica Kowalski, to introduce themselves to all of you. So they're going to talk a little bit about the work that they do with Canadian universities and libraries and how to get in touch with them if you're interested in databases and services of Adam Matthew that you don't yet have access to. So over to you, Alex and Jessica.
Thanks so much, Laura. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today, and massive thanks as well to our presenters, Laura, Lindsay, and Hans. As Laura mentioned, my name is Alex Burnsides, and I recently took over as the Adam Matthew contact for Canada. And it's been such a pleasure getting to know and work with so many of you over the past few months, and getting to know the unique and tight-knit library community in Canada. In addition to facilitating trials and answering questions about pricing information, I'm also very happy to work with you on promoting usage on any existing holdings that you may have, as well as to explore new and emerging areas of study at your institutions that Adam Matthew collections could help support, especially during this unprecedented time of limited and restricted access to physical and archival materials. We've also had the great pleasure to partner with Canadian consortia like CRKN and COPL. So if you are a member institution of either of these organizations, you have any questions about what collections you may have access to as a part of past offers, please do send me an email. Be very happy to work with you directly on that. You can see my email and phone number are included here on the screen, and I'd love to hear from you. And I'd also like to include a short plug for an upcoming customer appreciation event that we have that we're planning around this year's virtual Charleston conference. We've organized a virtual trivia game. It's open to everybody so that we can celebrate, our shared love of stories from the past and promote some lighthearted competition and fun since we can't meet face to face this year. So keep an eye out for more information on that soon. Also like to take an opportunity to introduce my colleague Jessica, who works in Canada to support our Cortex platform and technology. So Jessica, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Alex. I'm Jessica Kowalski. I'm the product sales manager for Cortex. And Adam Matthew Digital is celebrating 30 years this year. And since the launch of our first digital collection, Adam Matthew has actually always built its own platform in-house to publish the resources presented to you today. And the latest instance of this technology is called Cortex, and it's actually available for use by individual libraries and repositories. Since our official launch of Cortex at ALA Annual in 2018, we have over a dozen partners, and 2 of them are in Canada, and we're going to just show you those quickly now. Alex, can you go to the next slide? So University of Toronto, Mississauga began their Cortex site with their student newspaper collection, the Arundelian. And by running OCR on their collection, they were able to make their content fully text searchable. UTM has also made some recent updates to the layout of their site, and I think it looks great. Cortex provides you with the tools to design your own website without the need of any technical expertise. As such, at the beginning of COVID, they were able to easily add a bar with an update on their library hours and policies. UTM is currently working on publishing additional collections, as well as publishing a faculty research project. So keep your eye out on their site because it will also include Cortex's first interactive timeline, which we're really excited for. And then next, we are also working with McGill University. McGill is using Cortex on a project-based approach to use our handwritten text recognition, which Laura showed us a bit of earlier. Our HTR allows researchers to search for text and handwritten manuscripts, and we're pleased to share that in 2021, our HTR technology will also include full text transcripts. So when this functionality is released, HTR will work very much in the same way as OCR, just for handwritten materials. McGill University has also used our digital exhibition feature to build out an exhibit that provides an in-depth background for their Doncaster recipe collection. Both of these sites are publicly available, and we encourage you to go on and have a browse. And if you're interested in learning more about Cortex and how you can use this technology for your own archival collections, please let us know. And with that, I believe I'm turning it back over to Laura and for our Q&A.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And can you just put the next slide as well, please, Alex? And so we have 6 panelists from Adam Matthew over here to answer your questions. So please feel free to, we have 15 minutes now for Q&A. Please feel free to submit any questions to the through the control panel, and we'll be really delighted to answer any questions you may have. So we have a question on from Janice on what the answer was to the number of 71. Sorry, I may have rushed through a little bit, but the 71 is the number of Adam Matthew digital publications that that have the search word Canada appear in them. So we've almost published 100 digital publications by now, so that's a really large proportion of that. And I think the reason that I wanted to point that out is because we only managed to cover 5 collections today, and I just wanted to give you a sense that we have how much content we've published over the years across a number of different publications that we weren't able to necessarily touch on all of them today. So there's a question about whether you'd be able to replay bits of the recorded webinar highlights for your class, or arrange a digital for your class. And I'd say absolutely yes. I'd also love to hear from you. So I'd love to hear how this is being used in a class, and if there's anything else that we can do. I work in the outreach team, so my job is entirely surrounded with supporting these collections being used in the classroom. So my email is laurab@amdigital.co.uk. So please get in touch with me, and I'd love to hear more about how you might use that in the classroom. And yes, you can use the recording. So this next question might be best answered by someone from our editorial team. So maybe Hannah or Lindsay, you might be happy to jump on this one. So we have a question from Nicole on how archives provide us with these digitized items, and are the items already digitized, or do we handle the digitization process?
Sure, I can take that one. Thanks, Laura. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. So this is Hannah Davison. I'm a development editor. So I work on the early phases of putting a project together. So I can definitely speak a bit to how those projects come about in the first place. So it's essentially a mix of different scenarios. Sometimes we work with archives to publish content that they've already digitized. More often than not, we are doing a lot of research in archives to find content that hasn't yet been digitized. And part of a collaboration with us is that we work on that digitization together. So we work with a range of external digitization vendors who will digitize that material to archival heritage standards.
So you'll see that all of the images in all of our resources are very high quality, high resolution. You can always zoom in to read the full text and see images clearly. So it's essentially a mix of different scenarios depending on our relationship with the archive and how much material they've already digitized. It could be either of those situations.
So this next question is probably, Alex, if you wouldn't mind jumping on this about pricing. So there's a question about how much individual pricing is, or will that appear in the email that we sent afterwards? Could you talk a little bit about that, Alex?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. So Adam Matthew employs a bespoke pricing model. So we try to take a number of factors into consideration when providing pricing for a specific institution. Things like enrollment or population served, if you're not like a higher education institution, you know, the content of history departments and graduate level programs, things like that. So each price request that we get, we try to look at the individual situation at the institution and sort of treat it on a case-by-case basis. So we do provide a couple of different access and purchase options. Traditionally, we have always offered our collection for one-time perpetual access purchase. So if there was one title that you think would be really important at your institution and something that you see as being an integral part of the history curriculum for years to come, we offer perpetual access purchases. We also recently launched our AM Explorer platform, which Laura showed in the beginning of the presentation. It includes a federated search tool, and it provides annual access to the full Adam Matthew portfolio. I believe it's about 68 unique titles, and some of those have multiple modules within them. So depending on the circumstances at your institution, I'm happy to follow up with you directly. If you want to email me, it's Alexandra, ALEXANDRA @amedu.com. I'm happy to get to know more about the institution, what might be the best fit for you access-wise, and put together price proposals on sort of a case-by-case basis.
Great, thanks, Alex. Well, I should also mention that in the follow-up email where you receive the recording and the guide that we've created for you, I've also included Alex's email information on the follow-up email. So if you have any questions about pricing or free trials, her email will be there, and she'd love to hear from you. So please get in touch. And I also want to say thanks, Alex, for flicking through the PowerPoints through this presentation. It was very prompt and well done. Thank you. So we still have a few minutes if there's any final questions before we let you get on with the rest of your day. Okay, it looks like that was all of the questions. Obviously, please get in touch with us if anything comes to mind later. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Merci beaucoup à toutes et tous de nous avoir rejoints aujourd'hui. The recording of this webinar and our special guide of Canada highlights within the Adam Matthew collection should be with you over the next week, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of the week. Stay safe, and please get in touch if you want a free 30-day trial of any of these databases. J'espère que vous passez une bonne journée et une excellente semaine.